Well, I think sometimes we can fear getting asked questions about Christianity, but actually I think questions are a real opportunity to explain the gospel, so we don't need to fear getting asked them. I think one of the things that we fear getting asked questions is that we don't know how to answer them. People sometimes say to me, gosh, I love the way you can answer questions, but I just don't know what to say. How did you learn? And I say, well, to be honest, I learned by not knowing the answer. In other words, throw yourself into a conversation where you don't know how to respond, because there's nothing like the motivation of being asked a question you can't respond to go away and find out the answer. I think one of the fears that we have is that if we get asked a question we don't know the answer to, is that we feel, well, they'll never believe if I can't answer the question straight away. But actually the reality is, if you can't answer the question straight away, you can simply say, look, that's a good question. Can I go away and find out the answer? Can we meet up again? And the advantage of that is, firstly, you get to find out the answer. Secondly, they get to hear the answer. And thirdly, you get another opportunity to talk about Christian things. Somehow we end up conning ourselves into this idea that we have to have all our gospel conversation in one conversation, and we kind of get everything out on the table straight away. So I think it's a real gift when someone asks us a question we can't immediately respond to, because it gives us the opportunity to come back, say, a week later and say, hey, you know that question you asked me last week? I've been thinking about it, and then suddenly you're into another profitable conversation. So that's the first thing. I think we can be fearful of not knowing the answers, and I think if we can just take the pressure off and say, it doesn't matter if I don't know the answer, I can just admit that, go away and find out, and come back. That's helpful for both of me and the person I'm talking to. I think a second thing that's really helpful is to think about why people are asking the question. People might ask the question, why does God allow suffering? But that one question could be asked for all sorts of different reasons. It could be that they are suffering personally. It could be that they've just watched the news and there's been some natural disaster. It could be that they're thinking about the problem of terrorism. It could be that someone close to them is suffering. Or it could be that they've just studied philosophy at school and they've been asked this philosophical question about God's response to suffering. If he's all-powerful and all-loving, why is there suffering, and so on? So your response to the question will be very different depending on how people have asked or why people have asked the question. So I always think it's worth stopping, thinking, and potentially asking, where is that question coming from? For instance, if someone has asked the question because they're thinking about a natural disaster, and you respond to the question by talking about suffering being caused by human freedom and choices, it won't really answer their question. Or if they're asking the question because they've personally suffered in some very real way, if you answer in a very philosophical manner, again, you're not really going to get to the heart of the issue for them. So think about why the question's being asked and then respond appropriately. That's why there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to each question you get asked. I think another thing that's really helpful is to respond to questions with questions. You see Jesus doing this more than anyone else. Over 200 times in the Gospels, Jesus asks questions in response to people's questions many times. He doesn't always do that, but he particularly does that when people's questions are antagonistic, when they're trying to catch him out. And Jesus turns it round. So when they say, why should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? He says, well, show me a coin. Whose image is on it? Caesar's, they say. Well, okay, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. It's a brilliant response to what is a trick question. Or when they say to Jesus, by what authority are you doing these things? And Jesus knows it's a trick question. He turns it around and he says to them, John's baptism, was it from heaven or from men? And they go away, they have a little discussion. And they come back and they say, well, we don't know. And Jesus says, neither will I tell you. Which is interesting because it's not grammatically correct to say to someone who says to you, I don't know, to say, I won't tell you either. But of course, what they're really saying is, we're not going to answer your question, because they knew that it was a trick question. And Jesus is saying, and I'm not going to answer your question because it's a trick question too. So learning how to respond to questions with questions, I think, is helpful.